History as it happens, July 29th, 2021. Political violence, 1850s to present.
Let's have trial by combat.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
If those responsible are not held accountable, and if Congress does not act responsibly, this will remain a cancer on our constitutional republic.
The bloody decade before the Civil War serves as a warning about the perils of political polarization and the ways we rationalize violence when it serves our purposes. We're not headed for another civil war, but the investigation into the January 6th Capitol riot is a battle over the truth, where emerging narratives become detached from reality and perpetuate the cycle of us versus them. Are we reliving the 1850s? That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
There is a reason that Nancy Pelosi is the most disliked elected official in America.
They just want to be partisan. They just want to continue to attack the former president.
This cannot continue to be a partisan fight. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. But in order to heal from the damage caused that day, we need to call out the facts.
Okay, guys. Apparently, this tip of the spear has entered the Capitol building.
So let's begin by picturing this. A force of hundreds of armed men. They're in a lather after weeks of incendiary rhetoric, and they're convinced the future of their country is at stake, and converge on the stronghold of their opponents and go on a rampage. When it's over, much of the nation is outraged, but some Americans call them heroes. Sound like January 6th? Well, that actually happened in 1856, the Sack of Lawrence in Bleeding, Kansas. The Kansas Territory had two governments, one pro-slavery, one for free soil. Neither accepted the legitimacy of the other. Both camps armed themselves in what was a zero-sum conflict. Kansas could enter the Union in one of two ways, free or slave, not both. After Lawrence was sacked, the emerging narratives on each side painted dramatically different pictures of what had happened, deepening the polarization that would lead to civil war. So I thought of Bleeding, Kansas when I heard Congresswoman Liz Cheney say the January 6th riot was the worst attack on the Capitol since the War of 1812. Well, she's not wrong, but the sack of Lawrence may be the more apt comparison. It was a force of ordinary citizens, not a foreign army, resorting to violence because they would not accept their opponent's legitimate claim to office.
Each side said our government is the real one. And for a while, towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, it seemed as though there was a similar kind of debate over which election result is the legitimate one.
Historian Paul Quigley is back for a timely conversation. The House committee investigating the January 6th riot just held its first hearing at a time when former President Donald Trump and his supporters are rewriting history. Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger, a Republican ostracized by his party because of his anti-Trump stance, is pleading with Republicans to stop lying about what happened at the Capitol that day.
It's time to stop the outrage and the conspiracies that fuel the violence and division in this country. And most importantly, we need to reject those that promote it. As a country, it's time to learn from our past mistakes, rebuild stronger so this never happens again, and then we can move onward.
And D.C. police officer Michael Fanone, I'm sure you've seen him on TV by now, he delivered moving testimony about what he experienced fighting the mob. He is basically apoplectic at this point that some people continue to deny what happened.
During those moments, I remember thinking there was a very good chance I would be torn apart or shot to death with my own weapon. But nothing, truly nothing, has prepared me to address those elected members of our government who continue to deny the events of that day. And in doing so, betray their oath of office.
So you might think Democrats and Republicans should have no real quarrel when it comes to fully investigating the riot. Some call it an insurrection, even a coup. Whatever you call it, unity is not coming. The third-ranking House Republican, Elise Stefanik, held a news conference on that same day of the hearing to condemn not the rioters, but Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
She always puts her own partisan politics over what's best for the American people. She's an authoritarian who has broken the people's house. She is a lame duck speaker, and everyone knows it.
So this brings us to our key point about the cycle of polarization. There's more to all this than establishing the facts of what occurred on 1/6/2021, because comments like Stefanik's are part of the former president's campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the election system. Really, the legitimacy of our democracy, because he lost. You might recall one of the early episodes of this podcast was about Trumpism after Trump, the narrative of the stolen election. And as long as this cycle continues, the closer we get to legitimating violence for political ends, as Liz Cheney put it.
This will remain a cancer on our constitutional republic, undermining the peaceful transfer of power at the heart of our democratic system. We will face the threat of more violence in the months to come, and another January 6th every 4 years.
In the 1850s, nothing ultimately broke the cycle. The nation wound up fighting a civil war over secession and slavery. We're not heading for another civil war, but what might break our cycle today? What's it going to take to step back from this precipice? How are we going to avoid making every political issue zero-sum, where each side gets further entrenched in its own narratives? Paul Quigley is the director of the Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech. He's writing a book about one of the most violent incidents of the 1850s, the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. Paul Quigley, welcome back. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Devoted listeners of History as It Happens will recall you were my first guest on episode number 1 way back in January, when we were discussing a similar subject, the threat of violence before the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and Joe Biden, 1861 to 2021. Today we're going to talk about the 1850s and whether that bloody and polarized decade can teach us anything about what we're going through today. So let's start with, is it a historically sound comparison? What resonates with you about the 1850s?
I think there are really revealing comparisons to be made. You know, of course, we're not experiencing exactly the same thing as Americans in the 1850s. I tend to agree with Mark Twain or whoever it was who came up with that great quotation that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. I think that's a good way to think about comparisons between the 1850s and today. And for me, the key concept would be polarization, political polarization. The issues are very different and the framework is very different. So today it's not as regionally, geographically organized as it was in the 1850s. Today, there isn't that central issue of slavery involving so much of American life in the antebellum period, economics, culture, perceptions of morality. So there are really big differences, but I think it can be interesting and revealing to compare the two. And one of the ways I think we can compare the two in interesting ways, I know you want to talk about today, is political violence and ideas about whether violence is an appropriate way to carry on politics. If so, when, in what circumstances is political violence appropriate?
I think when it comes to violence, if you ask someone in the abstract, do you support using violence for political purposes, they would tell you no. But the issue here is how people come to accept violence as legitimate, right?
I would say that's true. And, violence has got a long history in American politics. The American Revolution was itself a form of political violence. So it's not like it's been absent, but people have tended to see violence that they support, agree with, as being in a different category than violence perpetrated by others with opposing political aims.
That's right. So let's describe, then, the climate in the country during the 1850s. Did Americans believe an actual civil war was possible or even likely as tensions mounted, not only across the country, but in the halls of Congress itself?
I think many Americans thought it was a theoretical possibility. And so there'd been a lot of talk of secession, other alternative forms of protest like nullification, and of civil war between the northern and the southern states. The concept was there in American political culture. I wouldn't say that necessarily means a lot of Americans believed this is actually going to happen. And certainly very few Americans predicted that it was going to happen when it did and at the scale it did. That was, fairly unexpected, I'd say, even in the 1850s.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we Americans today are not headed for another civil war with armies on a battlefield. But as you mentioned earlier, we do have a hyper-polarized climate, a zero-sum political atmosphere. And during the 1850s, there was violence in Congress itself. Right now, you're writing a book about Preston Brooks, a South Carolina congressman who badly beat a senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, after Sumner insulted him. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that incident and why it matters today?
Yeah, so the backdrop of Preston Brooks's assault on Charles Sumner was the big nationwide fight over slavery that Americans had been involved in really since the founding of the United States. And by the mid-1850s, we're in a situation where the fight in Kansas is underway. So there's been a repeated issue over whether slavery should expand into new territories, and when they become American states, should slavery be allowed there. Kansas is the latest one. And the Congress had decided in 1854 that in the case of Kansas and Nebraska, popular sovereignty would be the way to determine whether slavery was allowed. They'd let the people living there decide whether to allow slavery or not. And what that gave rise to was conflict and often physical violence in Kansas itself in 1854, 5, and 6. And so that's the backdrop to a major speech Charles Sumner, who, as you said, the senator from Massachusetts, he delivered in May 1856. And he came really, really hard at slavery. South Carolina in particular, he criticized, and even Preston Brooks's cousin, Andrew P. Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina. So Charles Sumner, in his speech, in addition to giving lots of attacks on slavery as an institution, he singled out Andrew P. Butler and made some personal references to his expectoration. He had had a stroke and tended to spit when he spoke. So this added, I think, insult to injury in the minds of Preston Brooks and other Southern congressmen, and especially because Brooks is his cousin. Andrew P. Butler was away. He was out of town when this speech took place. Preston Brooks believed it was his obligation, really, to defend his relative and the honor of South Carolina and the South as a whole and the system of slavery. So he entered the Senate chamber on May 22nd after the session had adjourned, but Charles Sumner was still at his desk working. And that's when Brooks assaulted him with a cane, basically to the point of unconsciousness. He hit him probably about 30 times over the course of a minute or so. So it's a very quick assault. And after it unleashed a fiery public debate over the meaning of this incident, whether it was okay to inflict this kind of violence in a political setting, and very interesting positions from the North and the South.
So it sounds like you're saying Preston Brooks had his defenders.
Yeah, definitely. Preston Brooks was defended by, I'd say, the majority of white Southerners, at least publicly. The typical story is that the nation polarized, or the polarization of the nation deepened as a result of the caning, with all Northerners lining up in opposition to Brooks and all white Southerners lining up in his defense. It wasn't quite that straightforward. I'd say the majority of white Southerners publicly defended what he had done, but there were examples as well of white Southerners, especially in the border states, or especially moderate white Southerners. There were indications that they weren't entirely happy with what he'd done, or at least with the way he'd done it, the place he'd done it. A lot of Southerners objected to doing this in the Senate. This was a sacred space in American politics. So lots of exceptions and some ambivalence. But yeah, the basic story is that most white Southerners defend what he's done.
And there are emerging narratives, different emerging narratives after the fact, similar to what we're seeing today with January 6th, right?
That's one of the really important consequences of the caning, I'd say, is the narratives that come out. One of the things I've been most interested in, one of the aspects of the public debate, is free speech. So for a lot of Northern critics of the caning, what they object to above all else is the idea that a senator could not say what he wanted in a speech in congressional debate without fear of violent reprisal. To them, regardless of what Sumner said, free speech should have been afforded him, again, especially in a congressional debate. So that's one of the key elements of the prevailing narrative in the North, is the importance of free speech.
When it comes to drawing parallels between the 1850s and now, I think Bleeding Kansas has a lot to teach us. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but let's talk a little bit about that really violent chapter in our history where in the Kansas Territory, pro-slavery settlers crossed the border into Kansas and rigged the election in favor of a pro-slavery territorial legislature. And the opposing sides form, militias, irregular armies, and a low-level civil war goes on for a while.
Yeah, that's right. This was all happening at the same time as the caning. In fact, the day between the conclusion of Sumner's speech and the caning itself, so May 21st, 1856, that was the day of the sack of Lawrence, which was one of the raids that pro-slavery settlers made on free settlers in Kansas. And then a few days after that, John Brown, who, we can talk about as well, what happened in 1859, but in 1856, he was in Kansas too. And a few days after the caning, he and his comrades launched a raid, the Potawatomi Massacre. They killed 5 pro-Southern settlers in Kansas. So all of this is going on at the same time, and people reading the newspapers in 1856 were absolutely connecting the dots and seeing all of these events as part of the same constellation. And so from the Northern perspective, people talked a lot about the concept of the slave power, the idea that Southern slaveholders were dominating American politics and had been for decades, and were engaged in kind of a nefarious conspiracy to consolidate their power, even though they were a minority of the American population, and to consolidate it with means including violence.
There was truth to the slaveocracy notion, right? Unlike today, where the Stop the Steal campaign is built entirely on lies, there was a slave power in the United States.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've got it exactly right.
So let's return to Kansas for a moment, because I think the real important parallel here is the 2 different territorial governments in Kansas, neither one accepting the other's legitimacy. Of course, the pro-slavery one was not legitimate, but neither side wanted to recognize the other.
There is a really powerful comparison with January 6th because, of course, the 2 sides couldn't agree on the nature of legitimate political authority in Kansas. Each side said, our government is the real one. And for a while, towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, it seemed as though there was a similar kind of debate over which election result is the legitimate one. As you say, the comparison isn't exact because in the January 6th example, there isn't really a strong case to be made, or any case to be made, that the election was illegitimate.
I'll throw in another nuance here. The number of people who believe the election was stolen in 2020 and are also willing to attack police officers and storm the U.S. Capitol is pretty small. But the percentage of Republicans who do still believe the election was stolen or something funny happened last November, that's a significant percentage of the voting population. To your point about the power of emerging narratives, different narratives about the same event.
And I think that explains the resort to violence, because if you see the stakes as being that high, as being the survival of the United States and legitimate political authority of the government, then you can understand why some people would believe that violence was an appropriate means.
That's an important question, right? Whether rhetoric by Donald Trump and other Republicans mean they're in any way responsible for what happened on January 6th. That was an issue in the 1850s, right?
I've gotten really interested in working on this book about Preston Brooks in the way people think about the relationship between language and physical violence. And in the case of January 6th, the issue is, does the rhetoric of Trump and other Republicans explain, or should we hold that rhetoric accountable for the events of January 6th? In the 1850s with Preston Brooks, it's a little bit different. The debate was over whether Charles Sumner's insults in his speech justified in any way Preston Brooks's violent response. Slightly different question, but the big issue is, what's the relationship between speech and violence? Is violence ever an appropriate response to speech?
Joanne Freeman, a historian who covers the same period you do, she identified 70 acts of violence in Congress in the decades prior to the Civil War. What were those incidents? We're talking fistfights, duels, stabbings.
Yeah, her book is fantastic and I'd recommend it to everyone. And she lays out in great detail this whole range of violence in and around Congress in the decades leading up to the Civil War. As you mentioned, this was everything from fistfights on and off the floor of Congress to duels. One of them was fatal, involving 2 congressmen in the 1830s. So Preston Brooks's caning of Charles Sumner wasn't an aberration, although I'd say it was an unusual incident because it became such a national spectacle. And of course, newspaper readers around the country were interested to read about these other violent conflicts between or involving congressmen. But the Brooks caning was distinct, I think, as a political spectacle because it was so violent and because it took place on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So those two things, I think, set the caning apart a bit.
I wanted to ask if Preston Brooks suffered any consequences. Was he arrested for assault?
He was, yeah. He underwent a criminal trial, had to pay a fine, and he also was subject to a congressional investigation by his peers in the House of Representatives. And so that's another comparison between the aftermath of the caning in 1856 and the aftermath of January 6th, because obviously it was extremely charged. There was an official committee from the House of Representatives. It had 5 members named by the Speaker of the House, who was a Republican Party politician, Nathaniel P. Banks. So unsurprisingly, he named 3 Republicans, and then there were 2 Southern Democrats on the committee as well.
Well, as far as I know, there were no cell phone cameras around in the 1850s. But even today, when the January 6th riot was caught on video 100 times over, we've all seen it with our own eyes. Some members of Congress, Republicans, continue to minimize what happened. One Congress member said it looked like just a bunch of tourists going through. Why do you believe, Paul, such preposterous claims can find a receptive audience? Is it because people are simply looking for stories to support their own narrative?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I also think there's a widespread distrust of the media, which feeds into it. So if somebody comes along and says, well, this narrative, this version of events is fake news, there's a subset of the population, I think, ready to believe that if it suits their purposes and their value system and political loyalties. I can understand the Republican Party leadership does not want to dwell on January 6th. There are obviously great dangers there for the Republican Party as an institution. So that, I think, helps explain why they're trying to evade it or trying to spin these ridiculous narratives of January 6th, the mob being a group of ordinary tourists.
You said that this could potentially be damaging to the Republican Party. I mean, that's part of the problem here, that one of our 2 major political parties believes it needs to be on the side of, well, I'm not sure. No one should feel like they have something to hide here.
Yeah, and I think one of the ironies is that the great political consequence, I'd say, of the caning in 1856 was the emergence of the Republican Party as a really strong contender in national politics. So the Republican Party in 1856 is a very new party. This is its first presidential election year. So in the run-up to the presidential election, it's able to use the caning to mobilize that image of Preston Brooks with his cane raised as an emblem of the slave power, the violence of slaveholders, as a way to attract voters to the Republican Party. And so one of the early slogans of the Republican Party was free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. And the free speech part of that certainly referenced the caning. And then, of course, everything else, free soil, free men, and so on, also referenced the surrounding issues that helped lead to Sumner's speech and Brooks's response to it. So there were political consequences for the way people explained the caning, just as I assume there will be political consequences to the way these narratives of the January 6th events are working today.
What should we call what happened on January 6th? A riot? An insurrection? Some people are calling it an attempted coup. What do you think of that?
I'd say all of the above are apt ways to characterize what happened on January 6th. I think it was an incredibly serious event with possibly very serious ongoing ramifications for American democracy, because I think once you get into a situation where the response to losing an election is to say that can't have been a legitimate election, then the democratic system, the electoral system itself is at risk.
I've been hesitant to call it an insurrection or a coup because it had no chance of achieving such an objective. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't the motivation, but I'm not sure the rioters themselves knew they couldn't stop the certification of the election. I'm not trying to minimize what happened, but we have to be precise with our language, and I felt that insurrection gives them too much credit, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely take your point there. It's hard to know what the people involved thought the outcome of that day was going to be. Also hard to know what politicians involved in creating the situation where this happened thought would be the outcome.
That takes us to John Brown. He wanted to start a slave insurrection. He attacked a federal armory, but of course his scheme was a harebrained scheme and it failed. But it was no less important for that reason, right? And emerging narratives happened there too.
Absolutely. And Brown's raid, of course, took place in October 1859, so even closer to the outbreak of civil war than the caning. And it was certainly one of those moments that forced Americans to pick a side almost, or to think hard about what the other side was up to and how this conflict was going to evolve. And I think the response from white Southerners was fear, first of all, fear of a slave insurrection. That was, for most white Southerners, worst nightmare, really, during the time of slavery. But they also, I think, reacted to the Northern response to Brown's raid. Even though in 1859, it would be a mistake to think that most white Northerners were abolitionists. They certainly were not. There was significant sympathy for what Brown had done, certainly in the category of the intellectual elite and some Northern media too. So it seemed as though to white Southerners that Northerners were sympathizing more than they expected they would with Brown's raid, which fueled the white Southern need to defend themselves against that.
Kind of a role reversal there. Southerners were defending Preston Brooks, and now some Northerners were defending John Brown in a way. And that left some people asking a question that we often hear today. How can anyone defend this nut? John Brown was a fanatic.
Yeah, and I definitely don't want to overstate the Northern sympathy, because I think the huge majority of white Northerners at this point were far from abolitionists. Maybe you could call it a vocal minority of abolitionist sympathizers, made it clear that they saw John Brown as a martyr in a noble cause. And that's what really aroused the fears of white Southerners.
So, Paul, I'd like to ask you about the long-term implications of what we're discussing about today and the 1850s. When the stakes appear so high, each side digs in even further. It seems de-escalation becomes less and less likely. The escalation feeds on itself. In other words, it seems we need a pressure valve to be loosened. Tensions need to be scaled back a bit, but I'm not sure what it's going to take to do that, to take a step away from where we're going.
Yeah, that's a really tough one to answer. You know, the 1850s, of course, feels as though something like the Civil War, some kind of huge crisis, was necessary to resolve the polarization that generation had experienced. But I always concerned about using the benefit of hindsight a bit too much and assuming that because the Civil War was the outcome of that polarization process, that was the only possible outcome and a necessary outcome. But it is interesting to think about how you get out of this spiral of polarization. I'm really not sure the answer to that. The pandemic could have done it, but obviously it did not. It reinforced and quickened polarization between the two sides. William Seward, in 1861, he was Lincoln's Secretary of State. He actually suggested in 1861 that if only there was a cause for the United States to go to war against a European power, some other country, that could bring the North and South back together and avoid this conflict that seemed to be brewing. So you never know what could happen. Hopefully that won't happen. It would be really difficult to predict how this cycle of polarization ends. You know, there's nothing to say it couldn't just fizzle out, even though in the middle of it now, it seems as though it just gets worse and worse.
Well, sometimes I wonder if I'm not overstating the case. You know, through the prism of social media and cable news, we do look really divided, but maybe reality isn't so bad. Then again, take the pandemic. We still can't get our population fully vaccinated because some people are resisting vaccinations for political reasons, still don't want to take the coronavirus seriously.
Yeah, and I think you're right. That's important to try and pick apart the reality of everyday Americans and their political loyalties and values and the depth of their hostility towards people in the opposing group, to pick that apart from media representations. And that's another really interesting comparison, I think, with the 1850s. Is to think about how much did the media make the most of or exacerbate the conflicts that arose as a result of the fight over slavery. And of course, that was a very real issue. It's not the case at all that the media is just inventing this conflict over slavery. That certainly exists. But in terms of events like Brown's Raid or the caning of Charles Sumner, the media certainly did play a part in codifying certain narratives and selling stories basically that would appeal to Americans. And often those were stories of polarization. The other side is the enemy. The other side is out to get us, our lifestyles, our values. That's obviously something that's true today as well.
Paul Quigley of Virginia Tech, we thank you for returning to the podcast to share your insights about political polarization then and now. On the next episode of History as It Happens, is Cuban communism breathing its last gasps of air?
But I will tell you, we will not wait, we will not sleep, and we will not stop until we change the regime.
The street protests in Cuba are provoking political responses in the United States and recalling a long, ugly history between superpower and tiny island nation. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.